Well, good morning. Happy Sabbath. I must say, these last few weeks make me realize how valuable it is to come together. When you can't, you realize, something I'm kind of taking for granted. I should not take for granted. So this is an absolute special time to come together. And as I was praying, Lord, what would you have me present? This is the message that came to me. And the title, as you see, is Have Mine Own Way, ? Basically, if you think about it, what is the original issue in the whole great controversy? And as Dave Fiedler presented in a way that to me helped crystallize it, basically there was a being right in the presence of very God, basically called him the covering cherub, which means he made it so the other beings were not destroyed by the presence of God, and so they could be understood. God could be understood. And at some point in his life journey, he felt, in this thing, God is wrong. I know better than him. And if you take it from there, if he's wrong in this, then I can't trust him. And so there come situations where I have to depend on myself. On what I think, not what God thinks. Therefore, if there's anything where the case you can't trust God, that's the original question. Can God be trusted? So therefore, if he puts out something, I have to make a decision. Do I do it his way, or do I do it my way? And if you come down to more recent times, there have been people on this earth who have openly chosen to be servants of that being who was at one time called Lucifer, the light bearer. He's now called Satan, the adversary, the devil, the dragon. That's all some of his titles. And he even put someone such as Alexander Crowley, I believe, he put out a book where, Alistair, yes, I knew it was A. But basically, it was, the whole sum of the law is, do what thou wilt. In other words, do your way. Have thine own way, or do what thou wilt. And the devil at times is blatant about this. And those of you who know what many of the movies are, they are inspired by that spirit. And many times he will put into movies what he intends to do. It's called predictive programming. And people can look back and they can see, how did they know? It's because devil's putting out what his plans are. It's not that he can see the future. This is what he's planning to do. And some would call this Jesuit theater, basically, which is one of the reasons I have personally chosen not to look at drama here on earth before Christ comes. Because anytime someone is doing drama, they are acting. What is acting? You are lying. That's exactly correct. And I don't think I want to expose my mind to lies. And therefore, it's safer. But I can tell you, that is one of the things that the devil has. If he's putting lies into he's putting his thoughts into your mind. And he does that in songs. In fact, if you want to know the anthem of this very idea was made popular by a singer you all know of, Frank Sinatra. In 1969, he did the song, I Did It, what? My Way. And if you read the very last stanza, It says, for what is man? What has he got? If not himself, he has not. To say the things he truly feels and not the words of one who what? Kneels. The record shows I took the blows. I did it my way. Yes, it was my way. So the message I'd like to have us look at this morning is, from the Bible, what can we learn about that? Now you remember, much better use of music is make it into scripture songs. Just saying. That's a much better way of using music. If you can't hear it, come forward. I'm projecting as best I can. We don't have a mic up here. So feel free to come forward. And maybe I won't be able to get so you can hear me. I apologize. But basically, if you know this one, 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, perfectly, I forget the exact word, for every good word, that the man of God may be complete, perfectly equipped for every good work. That's, I think, the New King James, but regardless, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable. So I was thinking, what in God's word would be a poster child for someone who did it his way? And the life that came to mind was Absalom. Do you know what Absalom means? Abba Salem, father of peace. He was not well named. Just so you know, his life proved he was not well named.
He had potential.
Oh, all of us has potential. One of the things that was brought up in the Sabbath school is, how can God love everyone when they're evil? Because God sees how they can be.
That's right.
And he can transform you into that.
Yes.
So, basically, let's go to where he's first mentioned, which is 2 Samuel 3. And it mentions how David was getting stronger at that point. He was already in Hebron. And in verse 2 it says, and David were born sons in Hebron. Firstborn was Amnon of Ahimacam, the Jezreelitess. Second was Chaliah of Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. We don't hear about that one again, as far as I know. I think one time he's called Daniel or something, but we don't hear much about him. Because the third is Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Timai, king of Geshur. By the way, Geshur was northeast of the Sea of Galilee in Syria. He was a king, a local king there. So some of these therefore were princesses. So what is it about Absalom? Well, his beginning is, in a sense, not as good as it might be. You think, well, how can he be better than the son of David? You know, David was a man after God's own heart, but he was not a very good father. He was off fighting people. And one of the reasons he wasn't a good father, he had too many wives. That is I can tell you, we're now smack dab in a dysfunctional home. If you have multiple wives, this is not a good thing. And any patriarch that had multiple wives was not well off. It caused confusion. Look at Abraham. Look at Jacob. Isaac was one that got it right out of that bunch. So, what's that? No. I just told you he was born. It was from the Geshur, the Jezreelites. You can, follow in your Bible, and you can check me out. It's 2 Samuel 3.
I trust you.
Well,
It causes me to
okay. So anyway, he wasn't of Bathsheba. That was Solomon. Actually, Solomon was the second-born. The firstborn died. But we're getting ahead of our story. Anyway, so he was from a dysfunctional home. So where do we see him again? Now turn to 2 Samuel 13. That's where we see things happening. And it's interesting, and I would have to build on what Vicki said earlier. Come earlier, you're going to find that God has a way of working both the Sabbath school lesson and the message to be working together. Because if you look at in chapter 13, what happens in the first 22 verses talks about Absalom's sister, Tamar. And as it turns out, Tamar was his sister, and is very good looking. We're going to find out Absalom was good looking as well. One of the things about David, he had an eye for beautiful women. Those are the ones that attracted him. And because he was king, he tended to be able to get them. But basically, this is a very, very good-looking woman, and this is a very ugly story. The firstborn decided he wanted his half-sister, and he had lust. Because he did all sorts of horrible things. His cousin, who suggested to him the plan of how to do it, was pretend you're sick, have her come in, prepare some food oh, I can't eat it out here, I have to eat it in my bedroom. Everyone else go away. Do you see red flags all over the place there? So bad things happened. There was rape, there was incest, and then there was rejection. So there was a lot of evil done right there. And this is Absalom's full sister, because it was his sister by both mother and father. And so, what was Absalom's reaction to all this? And in verse 20 of chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, Absalom her brother said unto her, her being Tamar, hath Amon thy brother been with thee? But hold thy peace, my sister, he is thy brother, regard not this thing. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. So every day he had this reminder with a sister who was just desolate in his house, that wrong had been done. And what did David do about it? David was very angry about it, but he didn't do anything. Why didn't David act? Because what's the penalty for this type of thing? Death. Why didn't he do it? He'd already committed adultery and murder, so he had no moral authority. What's our lessons for us today from this story so far? We can't do anything about what home we're born into. That is out of our control. What we can do is make a choice to choose God or not choose God. And so, why am I bringing this story up right now? Because we have to choose. Is it my way or his way? So the question to ask now is, evil has been done. Is evil done to us? Evil is done to us. Whose job is it to take vengeance? What did Absalom decide? I'm going to take vengeance. That's what he did. And so he plotted this for years, a couple, 3 years. And as was brought out in the lesson, if someone is that evil, what does we even said, what's the penalty for this? Death. So Absalom says, I'm going to kill him. How do you kill your oldest brother, the heir of the throne? He's the firstborn. How do you get away with that? Well, he decided there's a way to do this. It's during sheep shearing. Now, these are now adult men. They have their own businesses. One of the businesses that obviously Absalom had is he had sheep. And during shearing time, that's when you have the parties, and that's when you can have gifts to give. Remember the story of David and Nabal? It was during the sheep shearing. He'd guarded him the whole time, so he'd suffered no losses. He had more profit than usual. So hey, share some of your wealth. Well, so it was during sheep shearing. He said, Dad, bring everyone, let's have a party. And David said to Absalom, no, it's too much, it's too expensive, you can't do it. Well, then at least let my brothers come. And he'd already told his brothers. You can see that in 2 Samuel verses 28 and 29. And it's so interesting. When you look at this, what had he said to them? Now Absalom had commanded his servants, saying, Mark ye now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, when I sent you, smite Amnon and kill him. Fear not. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. What does that sound like? That sounds like a general. Be strong, be of good courage. And Joshua's, for the Lord thy God is with thee. Absalom did not say that. He said, I commanded you, right? It wasn't God that commanded it. And so the deed was done. They did unto Amnon as Absalom had commanded. So they killed him. That's what happened. So, what's one of the lessons we need to learn from Absalom's life? My way or his way? Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, not says me. And so what was now the train of events from this? Well, the news got back to David. He killed all the sons. And this same man that had pointed Amnon toward how he could have Tamar told the king, nah, that's fake news. He only killed Amnon. He knew ahead of time what was going to happen. I mean, that's so interesting. Now, what happened to Absalom after this? Could he come back with all, oh, I killed him, I'm good now, Dad? Could he do that? So what did he have to do? He had to flee. You can see that in verses chapter 13, 34 to 37. And where did he flee to? Well, of all places, of course, he went to his grandfather on his mother's side, king of Geshur. He went back to the family side. And what is this also telling you? Who had David married? Had he married all within God's family? He had wives of all sorts. Did God already have instructions through Moses of what they should do? They shouldn't be married outside, and they shouldn't be. That's why these trains are happening. You're having it your way. And the reason David was doing this is because it also, hey, we now have peace because we're all intermarried. By the way, fast forward during the last couple centuries when the royal houses all intermarried, how well did that do as far as bringing peace? Did that bring peace to Europe? They had wars no matter what. So it didn't help. So he fled there. And if you read in verse 38 of chapter 13, so Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there how long? 3 years. Just want to show when you do it your way, when you're there, you might, when you let God do it, you might have to flee like Joseph was in the dungeon for years. So you're also years, but what's the difference? You have peace when you're doing it God's way versus what was the whole time he was doing? Was he mad at everyone? How he'd been wrong? I was just doing the honor of my sister because my dad wouldn't do it. Now I have to flee. He was angry. So now we get to, how did Absalom get back to Jerusalem? Again, was my way or his way, right? Yeah. So David, hey, my oldest son is dead. This one's still alive. And you get the idea Absalom was a very attractive person, both physically and personality-wise. He knew how to turn on the charm. And David was a loving father. He wanted him back. And Joab noticed this. Who is Joab? Joab was the general of David's army. He was also his either cousin or nephew. I think it was his sister's son, if I'm not mistaken. Because it never mentions Joab's father. It always mentions his mother. So, because I think she was one of David's sisters. If I'm not mistaken, you can check me up on that. But he found a woman and says, we need to put on a play for the king, an act. Now, why is this of interest? Who did people come to for judgment? They didn't have a Supreme Court other than it was the king. The king made the final decision. That's why be careful who you choose as your king. We have a king who is God. He is a just God. When you choose your own way, how good is your judgment? Not very good. So she came, she told a story about her sons fighting, and now one killed the other, now she's going to lose her other one. And she eventually comes to it, and David goes, I've already promised you, I'm going to take care of it. But she kept pressing him. And so you read in verse 14, in verse 20, and chapter 14, verse 20, correct. To fetch about this form of speech hath thy servant Joab done this thing. Because David asks, what? Tell me more about this. Was Joab behind this? That's verse 19. And the woman goes, yeah, you got me. That is what it is. So now, once he figures it out, the king turns to Joab and says, behold now, I've done this thing, therefore bring the young Absalom again. And so he brought him, but he brought him to Jerusalem. But in verse 24, let him turn to his own home and let him not see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house and saw not the king's face. Now here's where it gets interesting. Again, my way versus God's way, right? So, now we have another time period of a couple, 3 years. And what's going on? The king is now morally, basically bankrupt. He couldn't really, when they asked him to judge, and they say, but king, look what you did, he can't be an accurate judge. And so, that infects the whole system. People come for judgment, and that gets put off. And Absalom is now the hero in the people's eyes. Because, hey, he avenged his sister because the king wouldn't do anything. And the Absalom now starts looking like a prince again. He's a very impressive looking person. And the people thought of him, this is a good guy. He's our hero. Well, Absalom goes, you know, I need to get the next step. I need to get the king to see me. And so he called Joab. Joab had gotten him all the way to Jerusalem. Joab wouldn't come. He called him again. It says he did him 2 different times. You can see that in verses, again, chapter 14, 29, and 30. In 29 it says, but he would not come. And when he sent him again, he would not come. So now, is he going to say, oh Lord, please send Joab? Is that what he does? No, I know how to make him come. One of Joab's businesses is lentils. I'm in the lentil business as well. His field's right next to mine. Burn his field. And don't hide it that you did it. So Joab, when he inquired, how come my field burned? Absalom's servants. So what's he do? What's up, Absalom? How come you did? Well, you wouldn't come. Do you get the idea who's doing? He's doing it his way. How is that a lesson for us? We can force the issue. Do you know if you force the issue and try to get ahead of God, it's not a good thing? That's right. It's just not a good thing. And so, he said, okay, I'll go intercede for the king to ask him to see you. And the king was ready to do that. Now, we get to chapter 15. Now, remember, the king is kind of paralyzed. Things are not going well because people are not getting satisfaction. Absalom is not happy with his father. He's already had some years up away from Jerusalem. Now he's here and he's not integrated back into the family. He's wanting it his way. Look, it's time for me to take over. I'm now the oldest of David's sons. And so he decided to plan for his rebellion. And if you begin to see, beginning in chapter 15, verses 2 to 6, and what's it say? He went to the place where David should have been, at the gate of the city. That's where all judgment was done. And what would he do? He rose up early. He was industrious. Do you notice that? He was there getting things done. And stood before the way of the gate, and it was when any man that had controversy came to the king for judgment, Absalom would intercept him and say, oh, where are you from? Tell me about your family. How are things going? And the servant said, well, I'm from this tribe of Israel. And Absalom said to him, let me hear you think. Your matters are good and right. You're right, you're right. People like to be told they're right. Do you notice that? But there is no man deputed of the king to hear. The king hasn't even made provision for you. King's not really functioning right now. And he said, oh, that I were made judge of the land. Do you know who's he working for? I did it my way. That's what he's doing here. And I would do him justice. And in verse 5, it was so that when any man came nigh to him, and in that culture, you'd bow to people, make obeisance. What would he do? He would put forward and say, no. Oh, no, you don't need to do that. I'm just like you are here. Right? Took him and he kissed him. You're my friend. Do you notice what he's doing? Calling people to God? No, they're calling it to him. Notice this is the whole bent of his life. It's all about doing it. And in verse 6, in this manner did Absalom to all Israel, and he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. with lies, flattery, deceit. That's what he did. And so finally he decided, okay, it's time to act. I got as many as I need to. And so he told his dad in verse 7, I need to go pay a vow in Hebron. Hebron was about 18, 20 miles away from Jerusalem. If you remember, that was actually where Absalom had been born. So he knew the area. And he says, while I was away from you, remember, Dad, we were away a little bit. I made a vow that if I ever got back, I would go offer some sacrifices in Hebron. Will you let me go? David says, sure, son. Oh, it's so good to see you're back to following Jehovah. You're worshiping God. He was completely deceived. So Absalom says, so he went. And in verse 10, because it talks about, but Absalom sent spies throughout the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. So he's making a plan for rebellion. And as we know, that had success. People did come to him. And it was when that finally happened that David kind of woke up. But if you notice in verse 11 of chapter 15, it says, and with Absalom were 200 men out of Jerusalem. They were invited, as we know. They were called. They went in their simplicity. They didn't know that they were participating in rebellion. They just thought, well, the king's son, the king's given permission. We're on an errand for the king. That wasn't it. And then you get to verse 12. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor, from his city. And the conspiracy was strong, and the people increased continually. Who was Ahithophel? Turned out he was one of David's very able statesmen, and he now hated David. Why did he hate David? He was Bathsheba's grandfather, and he knew what David had done to the family, and so he now was, hey, we have an alternative to David. This is my opportunity. Again, the same spirit. Do you notice what the spirit is? We're going to take vengeance on this ourselves. I'm going to do it my way. Now, what does David's response? In verse 14, it says, arise, let us flee, for we shall not escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly. Why was David had a very good place to start from. Jerusalem was a very good place to defend. You know what his attitude was? God anointed me. I'm not going to make the city he has chosen to put his ark in a place of bloodshed. And if he wants me back, I'm going to let him be the one to bring me back. I'm just going to follow where he leads me. It was the opposite of Absalom's. Notice that. And if you think about it, again, Ahithophel was filled by which spirit? The devil spirit. You can look at that in verses 20 to 23. He advised, this is really stuff that's horrible. He said, you know what you need to do, Absalom? When you come, the king always left a few of his concubines, some of his secondary wives, in charge of the palace and so forth. But anytime a new king comes in, first thing he does is he takes over the previous king's harem. That shows he is king. And if you remember, that point came up later with Solomon, when one of his older brothers wanted a woman who had been one of David's concubine as his wife. And when he asked Bathsheba to ask Solomon, and Solomon said, no, if she has her, that's the equivalent of saying he has the throne, because now I have the former king's wives. So that's what led to that being done. So basically, the reason Ahithophel wanted Absalom to do this is because, if this thing goes south and we don't succeed, Absalom has already known he can kill one of David's sons and still be reinstated, so he might finagle a way to get back in David's good graces. But who's going to be the one that's going to be blamed? Oh, it was this Ahithophel who had. So he said, I'm going to make it so David can't do that. And that's what that was all about. And then David was perplexed. What's he going to do? And that's where Hushai shows up. He's another counselor who chooses who's going to follow David into exile. And David says, no, you're more useful to me serving the new king and keeping me informed of what's going on. And we can read about that. And he actually, because when they came into Jerusalem unopposed, so far the conspiracy was going great. But what happened? Ahithophel says, you know, David hasn't got his forces together. Let me go after him with 12,000 chosen people. We'll get him before he's got a chance to reorganize. All we have to do is kill the king, and your kingdom will be secure. And Absalom goes, that sounds like a great idea. But then once the meeting was over, he says, you know, Hushai is another wise man. Let me run it by him. Hushai said, I'm going to give him different advice. And what did he do? He appealed to Absalom's vanity. Remember, I did it my way. No, remember, he's an experienced fighter. He won't be easy to find. And then if there's a little battle and we lose, that'd be bad. Let's get everyone together, and then you, the glorious commander, will lead and have all the glory to yourself, not to Ahithophel. And he chose that. Turns out that was to his downfall. Who recognized that that was going to be the downfall? Ahithophel. Because he had said, okay, this is not going to succeed, I can tell. He went home, set his house in order, and ended his own life. That's already, we're beginning to see, what is the result of I did it my way? Death. That's right. Now here's what's interesting. Remember, at the battle, because David actually ended up going to where? He specifically chose where he went to. Mahanaim, which is the place where Saul's house had been. And when they were fighting against David, it's a very well fortified area. But it also turns out by now that most of the people of the population around it were on David's side, so it turned out to be a very good choice. And finally, Absalom said, okay, it's time to take that out. And he brought his army, and the place they chose to fight was a wood, which a big army all got disorganized, and it was hard to control. They ended up suffering a loss, and in the confusion of the battle, Absalom started to flee. Remember, he was one of the most perfect physical specimens there. So he was a very attractive man. And he had long hair. He did not suffer from loss of hair. He had plenty of hair. He had good hair. Except it was his downfall because it got caught. But before the battle, David had told all the commanders, deal gently with my son Absalom. You can see that in chapter 18 of 2 Samuel, verse 5. I mean, this also tells us a man who has God's heart. God's love is almost unreasonable. But that's the way the father was. And so, because of his he had not cut his hair. Apparently he called it, it would get so heavy he would cut it. And he was hanged in an oak. So what was his end? Basically, once he was there, a soldier came across him and left him there. And you read verses 12 to 14 of chapter 18, because Joab, when the word came to Joab, he said, why didn't you kill him? He says, the king commanded us not to do that. If I did that, you could give me all you want, but he'd still come after me. I'm not doing that. What did Joab do? I don't care. This guy if I hadn't gotten him back, this whole thing wouldn't have happened. 20,000 people would not have died in this battle. He's the cause of it. I'm going to end it right here and there. He took 3 darts. Absalom was not wounded. He was just stuck. And he died. 3 darts through the heart. So it was just a very horrible death. And you look in verse 18 of 2 Samuel 18. He just had a pillar, and they took his body down and covered it with stones. That was all he had left. Now, in contrast in that, let's look at the person in the Bible who exemplifies not my will but thine. Who is that? Jesus. And I came across, and we kind of touched on that in the Sabbath school as well. But I came across, as I was studying this morning, a quotation. It's from Review and Herald, January 3, 1907. Christ laid aside his royal robe and kingly crown, and I could add all here, his also role of creator, and assumed the form of humanity, in order that humanity, through his merits, whose merits? Jesus' merits, might partake of the divine nature and escape the corruption that is in the world through lust. Is that what Absalom's life was all about? He was subjected to the fiercest assaults of Satan, but not for a moment did he yield to the terrible temptation brought against him or become discouraged in his work of bringing redemption to his race. He gave his life for the salvation of a fallen race. Who can understand the depth and breadth of a love so amazing? And as was noted earlier, I don't think we ever will. The more we get to know God, the more we're going to find it, how could you do that? So Jesus was the Lord of glory, the commander of the heavenly host. He came to reveal the Father, to do the Father's will, not his will. To be our perfect example. It was all about thy will be done. So you can turn to that story in Matthew 26. This is Gethsemane. So if you want to turn to that, this is something that is worth reviewing. And beginning at verse 36 of Matthew 26. And what's the first thing he's saying if you get to verse 36 here? Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto thee, I'm sorry, that was 34. Let's go to 36. Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto his disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. So what are we supposed to do? Pray. Keep praying. And I came across another phrase. It was just a sentence. I'll see if I can find it. Here we go. Anyway, what it is sanctification. What is sanctification? Sanctus means, sanctu is holiness. So sanctification, becoming holy, is continual communion with God. That's why it's so important. The first thing, what was the keynote of Christ's life? Continual communion with God. And at the beginning of every day and the end of the day, spend extra time with God. I mean, that is basically what it's all about. And now we get to verse 39 of chapter 26. And it says, well, start with 38. My soul is exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. That's what he's saying. Again to his disciples. Watch with me. And went to the little Father, and fell on his face, and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, this is so important, not as I will, but thy will be done. Now this is Jesus, the commander, our Creator, saying, I am going to trust my Father. I'm in the form of humanity, the form that each one of us is. We're watching, we're talking, and then we're going to follow what he leads, not as I will. Yeah. Thy will be done. And you get to 41 and 42. Watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again in 42, O my Father, if this cup may not pass from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And in verses 44 to 46, and he left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words, O Father, let this pass from me, right? Yes. Then cometh he to his disciples and saith to them, Sleep on now, take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of his enemies. Rise up, let us be going. Behold, he is at hand that doth betray me. What made Jesus able to go through all this? Constant communion and surrender to God. So the reason I'm bringing this out is, let's look at the life of the two choices. Do what thou wilt versus have thine own way, right? Both actually died horrible deaths. And you could argue that the death of Christ was more horrible. It was much more prolonged. I mean, Absalom was hanging there, very obviously terrorized that someone's going to find him, and certainly they did, and it wasn't from his side. They didn't cut him down. And then Joab shows up, who he has wronged, and not reconciled. He did it his way, and he caused a lot of trouble, and darts were thrown through his heart. He died a horrible death, and what was the remembrance of this man? He had a legacy of murder, treason, incest, rebellion, infamy, brought on by what? His choices of having it do it his way. Self, exactly. What was Jesus' legacy? He did it God's way. He did self-sacrifice. He had, like we just read here, the evil one on his path his whole life. He had a very horrible death in the sense physically, but he was hanging on by faith to his Father the whole time, and his final yell was a yell of victory. Into thy hands I commend my spirit. So he had God's peace. So, how does that apply to us? We will have trouble, injustice, there'll be war, there'll be famine, there'll be persecutions, there'll be displacement, financial issues, personal issues, interfamily issues. We talk about in some of the stories, all the different difficulties. Will we face those things?
Yes, we will.
Why is this important? We want to have it God's way. If we are trusting God, He can, what do we decide? We want His life living through us. He's already proven He can do it. And He's all powerful. And He wins. And His is the only side that can resurrect us at the end. Even if we die, for example, with our head chopped off like John the Baptist, I've been here, I did everything for you, Lord. But when Christ said, show him, you were pointing to the right person. See, my minister is exactly what you foretold. He had peace. And in the resurrection, will there be reward? Like nothing else. So with that in mind, we all have a choice every day. In fact, every moment. Remember I said sanctification is continual communion or habitual communion with God. We have a habit of constantly, in every situation, turning to God and asking, talking to our Father, what should we do? So what will be our choice? My way or His way? So that's our choice. Back to the sermon title. Have mine own way, ? Or have thine own way? So if you're in agreement with me, let's sing our closing hymn, which is in fact, have thine own way.